All right, my English teacher friends. So in this writing workshop video, I have a practice FRQ3 for AP language and composition. But in saying that, if you're doing argumentation at any level, this is going to work for you. So I'm heading out of February break, and we're just a couple of months before the exam. And I want to practice doing argumentation just a couple of more times to shore it up before exam time. I find it's the easiest portion of the AP language exam, and in terms of the expository modes, even outside of an AP language context, I find this to be my starting point for my on-level 9th and 10th graders. It's far easier to do argumentation than rhetorical analysis or literary analysis, even synthesis, because the textual support is coming right from the students' noodles. So it's right in their sweet spot. It's right in their wheelhouse. So there's no juggling of sources. There's no interpretation of text. Very easy peasy. So for this one, I'm going to use a quote by the one and only Slim Shady himself, Eminem. And here's the prompt. So it says, Eminem, an American musician, record producer, poet, actor, and activist, opined the following. If you have enemies, good. That means you stood up for something. So I'll read that again. If you have enemies, good. That means you stood up for something. Write an essay in which you argue and explore the nature of this claim. Use appropriate evidence from your reading experience or observations to support your argument. So I wrote this very much in the same vein as the last few years of FRQ3s. It's very similar to the Colin Powell one from last year. It's just a different quote, but the compositional approach, the execution of it is going to be the same. And then the kicker with me is that my students always use my templates. So we'll talk about declaring and inverting the thesis in the introductory paragraph, and then we'll tackle those body paragraphs syllogistically. So one of the things up front that I do a little different, it sounds like the more I travel around the ELA circuit, is for all 6 FRQs, so the 3 on Lang and the 3 on Lit, I always advise my students, because it is a timed exam, of course, it's a grueling time exam, to do 4 paragraphs per FRQ. So intro, 2 bodies, and a nice solid conclusion. And my students have never been penalized for that whatsoever. I know that there are some staunch 5-paragraph supporters, activists out there that say it has to be 5 paragraphs. I just find, for the time crunch, doing 5 paragraphs is a lot. And the manner in which my students manipulate their first premise, especially for rhetorical and literary analysis, a 4-paragraph bagger is plenty, and they can tackle all the ground that they need to. So as always, my little aside is you gotta Bob Ross your instruction. You're gonna see some student samples that my kiddos wrote, and in order to get them to write at this caliber in the month of February, I get my kids the day after Labor Day, so they've been with me a few months. So to get this type of writing, I've had to stand at the proverbial easel and canvas, just like Bob Ross, and I paint with my students. I'm the expert writer in the classroom, and with my work through the National Writing Project, whenever I have teacher participants in any of my professional developments, I say, hey, position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom. Get to that canvas, get to that easel, and paint. A la Bob Ross. He never held back. He never dumbed it down for his students, and the kicker with him is that he used a heuristic. We call it templates in composition. He used the wet on wet technique, and I always use the declarative and the inverted thesis and the syllogistic method. So it really demystifies the writing process. So no matter what natural landscape Bob Ross was doing with his students, always wet on wet technique. No matter the expository mode or if it's for an exam, declare, invert, syllogistic. Always, always, always. Easy peasy. So before we get into the introductory paragraphs, let's talk about what a declarative and an inverted thesis are. So when we ask the question, so how do I write the introductory paragraph? I tell my students for argumentation, synthesis, and persuasion, even research, you have two options. You can declare the thesis or you invert it. So immediately out of the gate, you would say something about that quote, the quote that Eminem opined. And, you can agree with it, disagree with it, challenge, refute it, spin it around, turn it over like a rock, and have at it. So immediately just begin with the thesis. Now, without regurgitating that prompt and restating it and, totally parceling it out, you can add some context and background. One of the things that my students will be doing in their exemplars that you'll see in just a second is they'll have a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT caliber words. And I do an intensive word study academy with my students because I know there's a vocabulary void. On day one, on September 7th, I know that they're going to come to me, most of them, with a very small lexicon. And in order to have that grow over time, over the academic year, exponentially, I do intensive word study academies with my students. And I go over all of that in my National Writing Project courses. And I have a few things in my YouTube channel as well to go over that. But you'll see my students wield some pretty decent vocab in this. Sentence constructs. This idea comes straight from my Nuance Academy that I run with my students and with my teacher participants. And I borrow heavily from the work of Strunk and White in their seminal text called Write It Right. They make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So in order to get that unicorn point, that sophistication point, I firmly believe that students need to really teeter-totter the tier 2 with a tad bit of colloquial and vernacular. You don't want to totally geek out, but you don't want to be, too flip either. It's a teeter-totter balance. And then the sentence constructs to get that voice rhythm and flow that's so essential to sophistication. You got to be able to wield some syntactical maneuvers that offer some greater complexity than just wielding, independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences, which our struggling and emerging writers tend to over-rely on. So you'll see my students have good voice rhythm and flow through their syntactical manipulations. And then the big kicker, every time my students are writing introductions, they're going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So we can take this declarative thesis and flip it on its head. And the only thing that changes here is that you start with the context background. In argument, it's a good place to have a hook or an analogy. So students can do that. Context, background, hook, analogy. And then as you're funneling it down towards the 4th sentence, the 4th sentence is going to be the thesis statement. So it does not matter. One's not more correct than the other. One's not more sophisticated than the other. And the College Board, I don't think, has a preference either way for it. So let's do it. How do I write the introductory paragraph? So you're going to see my students either declaring or inverting. So here's how it goes. History has made it abundantly clear that those individuals who indelibly get etched into the annals of time ignore public opinion and govern their hearts and lives by their own decrees. Being a lemming is easy and safe, but the true meaning makers come to that proverbial fork in the road and choose the path least traveled. In standing up for principles and values that go against public opinion, many a man in history has made a fair deal of enemies, but righteously so. So we can see down here that it's an inverted thesis, right? You hear the echo, the refrain of the prompt. So let's go back to that prompt for just a second. I tell my students, oftentimes when you get prompts that give you a quote and you have to argue the merits of the quote, that you have to parcel out the key diction in it. So we have to say something about enemies and goodness and standing up, right? So something, closely akin to that. And we have it in this last sentence here. So look at how this articulates the thesis. In standing up for principles and values that go against public opinion, many a man in history has made a fair deal of enemies. So there you go. You got the word, but righteously so. So you can see that this student is implicitly agreeing with Eminem, and that's all you have to do, right? To get a thesis statement, it's that easy peasy. So it goes first or last. But you can see here, you don't front load and get into your textual support. You don't regurgitate the prompt or anything like that. Just a straight up nuts and bolts thesis is all it takes. Vocab is up, sentence structures are flowy and supple, and that's all it takes. So student number 2 comes to the easel, comes to his canvas, and writes this. We live in a society obsessed with public opinion. But as is evidenced in so many facets of life, whether it be politics, literature, or pop culture, meaningful, impactful, and purposeful leadership has never been about popularity. In fact, some of the greatest and most memorable persons in history left this earth with a ton of enemies because they governed their lives through deeply rooted personal convictions, not the sway of the majority. So you see, we're getting anchored in the prompt here. So one way to do this when you're inverting the thesis is to front load your line of reasoning. And you're going to see that the student is doing this. By saying politics, literature, pop culture, we can anticipate body paragraphs about such things. Now look how much they front load it in the thesis statement. Eminem hit the nail on the head, especially if you look at the likes of Alex Jones and Gregor Samsa. So going with a political and a political figure and a figure from literature. So you can see that they've already set up their body paragraphs for their line of reasoning. This is a real easy way to do an inverted thesis. So it's kind of like, playing a game of poker and you show your cards to your opponents, or you're a quarterback and you come to the line of scrimmage and you call out to the defense the play that you're going to run before you run the play. That's kind of what you got to do in composition with a thesis statement. So student number 3 comes to the plate. And this is one of my struggling and emerging writers. And he felt it safe to declare, because I was walking around the room just milling around. He had his blank screen, his blank sheet of paper, and he was like, I don't know what to do. And I said, what do you think? Eminem made that comment. What do you think? And he said, Eminem is 100% correct in his assertion. Those who do not succumb to the sway of popular opinion, but instead adhere to their deeper convictions, tend to amass a few enemies. So the thesis comes first. So it doesn't really matter if it's first or last. And then they're going to front load again. Literature and politics. So I'm expecting a paragraph on literature, a paragraph on politics. Literature and politics are a clear case in point. The lemmings of life play it safe, but they also write themselves out of the history books and great works of literature by doing so. 2 persons who garnered a few enemies because they planted firm roots in the soil of their individual beliefs are the Fort Fisher Hermit and Kobe Bryant. So you name your paragraphs, right? So we're going to have a paragraph on the Fort Fisher Hermit and a paragraph on Kobe Bryant. So 2 and 3 are done pretty much the same. Number 1 just is the same inverted model, but they did not front load the direction that they're going, which is totally fine because you're going to do so in the first premises. So the next question is this. We're done with the introductory paragraph. We declare, we invert, we focus on our tier 2, our sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences. We're rocking and rolling, and then we have to ask ourselves this question. How do I construct the body paragraphs? And as always, if you're familiar with my work, we know that we can proceed syllogistically. So what is a syllogism? I'm going to give you a quick cursory flyby on this. In my YouTube channel, I do some major deep dives into the history of Aristotelian logic and reasoning. We get into deductive and inductive, deductive reasoning, the whole history of the syllogism. So suffice it to say, I'm going to be very brief in this, and if you want to go deeper, then go parcel through the YouTube channel and scope it out. So in brief, Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the aristocratic boys would go there, the rich boys of the town, to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they would throw out these juicy, essential questions, kind of like what we're doing for this essay. And one classic question that is in Plato's Republic is this: What is justice? And these great philosophical think tankers, these scholars, these philosophers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what is justice. And then the other boys would refute it, they would challenge it, they would qualify it, and they ultimately nullify it. And the next great philosophical think tanker would step to the mic, and it goes on in perpetuity, right? So you can't come up with a definition of what justice is. It's ineffable. So Aristotle noted that his best orators, his best speakers, his best debaters were doing something that the others weren't. And one day he had his eureka moment and he said, aha, I got it. The really good orators are arguing syllogistically. And what he meant by that is that there's a mathematical computative formula ingrained in the logic of the speaker. And what they do is they go premise, premise, conclusion. So if I were to say, premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. You'd all nod your heads and say, Christian, very sad for your dog, but that's cogent, and that's Aristotle's word. He used the word cogent a lot. It's cogent. It makes sense. It's logical. It's bulletproof. It makes absolute sense. But when our students write, oftentimes, and especially for FRQ3 for the Lang exam, oftentimes they only present a second premise. So they get into their textual support and they get talking about, in essays like this, they get going on and on and on about the Boxer Rebellion or, the movie Shawshank Redemption, whatever it is they want to talk about. And they don't argue. They cease to argue. We have to remind kids this is an argumentative essay. So the whole thing needs to be there. You need a first premise, a second premise, and a conclusion within the logic. So in terms of adapting this for a template for the purposes of creating an argumentative essay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to name the parts. Premise 1 is an argument containing a why reason. Up top in the thesis, we did not state why. We don't get into the whys. You're going to house that in the first premise. Here's some math for you, and I'll model this a couple of times. The first premise is always going to be 3 sentences long. Here's the reason. On FRQ1, the College Board says 3 times, your argument must be central. And I wish they would say that for all 6 FRQs, because expository writing is an act of argumentation. It's an act of argument. So in order to keep the centrality of the argument, I like my students to take 3 sentences to articulate that why reason. Textual support comes right from the kids' recall, comes right from their noodle. They can write about anything they want, right? As long as it's pertinent and germane to the prompt and the demands of the assignment. And then the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, and I want to be really clear on this. The conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph is the links and the echoes back to the thesis and the prompt. A syllogism comes full circle. And all of this in terms of the move is going to take about 10 to 12 sentences. Every single syllogistic body paragraph, no matter the expository mode. I tell my students to shoot for 10 sentences, pretty much hard cap it at 12. I think if you go more than 12, you're going to blow V8 and break the line of reasoning, get a little wayward. And those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that kids are so accustomed to write really don't develop and flesh out an argument with any substantive detail. So I broke down the parts for you. You can see the first premise. Second premise begins at the 4th sentence, and then I ran out of space, so it's going to continue on to the next slide. So let's take a look at this. Sometimes even the nicest and kindest people in the world garner their fair share of enemies. So I wrote this one, all right? This is one that I model for the kids. You have to stay anchored in the thesis, even in your first premise. So I'm going to use the key diction of the prompt in my why reason, all right? So I focus on enemies. In fact, in studying the lives of deities and saints, they too have been spurned by adhering to their convictions and deeply rooted principles. For as long as oppositions like good and evil, black and white, and up and down exist, people will always be with enemies, even if they are righteous in every core molecule of their being. So that's a clearly articulated why reason. Took 3 sentences. And again, you front load a little bit. You give the direction. You drop the seed to your line of reasoning that's going to grow in the second premise. Second premise begins fourth sentence, and I tell my students immediately get into your source. So look at my transitional phrases, my transitional phrase here. Take, as a perfect case in point, Mr. Rogers. While seemingly the innocuous face of a children's television program, Fred Rogers stuck his neck out innumerable times to help instill his philosophy of what it means to be a good neighbor. And then my buzzword for the second premise. My students get tired of me saying this. I say specificity, 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 specificity all the time. You got to be as specific as possible in this. Get detailed. Don't be vague. So I don't like it when my kids talk about the civil rights movement, because you only have about 7 sentences to do it, or racism, or Hitler. It's too broad, it's too vague. So hone in on something really specific. So look how detailed I get here. In the summer of 1969, public swimming pools were still segregated by race. During a major heat wave that swept over the nation, several uprisings occurred in major U.S. cities to protest the injustice that blacks did not have access to public pools. So I go on, still in my second premise here. To show his support for the causes of equity and inclusion, Rogers filmed a classic episode that saw Officer Clemens meander into the neighborhood, a police officer on the beat, hot and sweaty. Mr. Rogers is seated by a kiddie pool with a hose. To symbolically show his solidarity, Rogers invites Officer Clemens to remove his shoes and socks and join him with a cool foot soaking. This is quintessential Fred Rogers. He did episodes to address the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He covered the Iran hostage situation of the 70s. He even covered the space shuttle explosion and the attacks of September 11th. Right, so I just give a little list here, some enumeration of the things he did that were questionable, that garnered him some enemies. But you can see here, I know the facts. I'm a Mr. Rogers connoisseur, right? I know this stuff, so I'm detailed. In the end, listen to the refrain back to the thesis and the prompt. I should say something that echoes those two things. Clearly, his faith-based approach was met with the ire of many. So by saying ire, I'm into the enemy aspect. Regardless, Mr. Rogers continued to stand up for his beliefs no matter what opposition he faced. And that's all it is, my friends. Why reason, specificity, and then in the end, tie it all back. So the question's this: what do I do next? All you do is bust out another syllogism, and you're going to follow the same mathematical pursuit. 3 sentences, first premise. Second premise, get into it at the 4th sentence and run with it. So this one's interesting. I wrote this one again, and I would be interested to hear some of the comments on the YouTube channel or in the Facebook groups about this one. I teach in a school that tends to be pretty conservative. We're like a purple area, but we have some real staunch conservatives, especially in my AP classroom. And there have been years where I've looked at scores and I'm like, geez, I thought, Johnny was a slam dunk 5. Why did he get a 3 on the exam? And we'll purchase the essays and I'm like, I got it. I think he took like way too hardcore conservative bent on something. And I know that the college, I'm going to say something very unpopular right now. The College Board is very liberal, very, very liberal. And I find most readers to be liberal as well. So I didn't experiment with my kids to take a political hot topic and to swing it highly conservative, highly red, to see if the Mr. Rogers example is of greater merit than kind of a social pariah at the moment of recording this, Kanye West, for his his remarks. So by no means whatsoever am I espousing, my support for Kanye West. I'm just giving an example here to my kids of be careful, know your audience. And maybe I'm completely wrong on this, but I just have seen in 21 years of teaching AP Lang, some of my students get hurt for what they say on question 3. So look where I go here. It's going to write itself the same way. The 3 sentences first premise, 4th sentence begin the second premise, specificity, 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 echo refrain at the end, 10 to 12 sentences. In an era where it is seemingly unlawful to speak up against some of the red flags raised during COVID, a few brave patriots have not only risked their reputations, but their lives in trying to be voices of reason and truth. The alleged conspiracy theorists who speak up against the deep state ultimately get barred and banned from their platforms while being smeared in left-wing news outlets. Speaking up in this manner is definitely noble, but it comes with the price tag of being branded public enemy number 1. So let's just talk about compositional execution here. I did the same thing that I did with the Mr. Rogers one, state my why reason. But here's the difference, right? It's got a political bent. So using words like noble and public enemy number 1, deep state, the voice of reason, brave patriot, unlawful to speak, red flags, right? My diction's very fiery in this, and sometimes students go that route. They have a lot of pathos when they write. I think it might be a turnoff to some readers, and maybe some of you in me reading this viscerally react to that, and then think about AP readers. Are we grading writing, or do we grade the content of what's being addressed here? So 4th sentence, transition into the support. Take as a case in point Kanye West, one of former President Trump's staunchest supporters. Like many Americans, Kanye's been very vocal about the fact that the political left is dictating what can and cannot be said on social media platforms. As odd as it may seem, in a land that promises free speech, one of our former presidents has been barred from numerous sites for stating that he feels the election of 2020 was stolen. Kanye, very vocal in his views that the government system is rigged, has made quite a stir in advocating for an investigation into the ethics of the Biden administration. So we go on here, still shooting 10-12. Even though each American is guaranteed the right to free speech, West has had all of his apps locked for espousing such beliefs, plus many others. To no surprise, left-wing media outlets have gone to great lengths to smear West's reputation. Acting as if they are clinical psychologists, they've done everything from deeming his outrage to an unhinged bipolar episode to even going so far as saying that his behavior is a manifestation of post-divorce narcissism. All right, specificity. I give a lot of detail there without going on and on and on and belaboring the point. So look at the swing back to the prompt and the thesis. Being a voice that runs against the grain of the mainstream narrative is definitely one way to garner a few enemies. So again, say the words from the prompt, say the words of the thesis. But here's the thing. People like Kanye West are the true American heroes for being the mouthpiece of the voice of reason. And again, it's executed the exact same way. The exact same template is at game. But I think as we talk about FRQ number 3, we really need to caution our students about what they use for their second premise. I think it really matters. And you think about a lot of like cliche things that kids talk about in this. I don't know, I've read several thousands of exams, get a lot of civil rights, MLK, global perspectives of racism. I don't know. I tell my students to avoid those things. Just as for FRQ3 on the AP Lit exam, there are certain books that kids just overly write about, and I want my students to be authentic and to jump out as a true individual, an authentic, free-thinking individual. So I caution them about what to say in that second premise. All right, let's wrap this up. So if you got questions or want to try your hand at Bob Rossing some of your own samples, feel free to reach out, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also know that I run a slew of professional development opportunities through the National Writing Project, and we go all year long. So we'll get you during the school year or during the summer months and vacations if you so choose. We have a self-paced course for those that want to go at their own level and on their own time. And we do 5-week masterminds, free webinars, one-offs, 2-hour intensives. So check out teachinghowtowrite.com, and there's a whole bunch of information there. So hopefully this serves you well and you can use it in your classroom. Be well for now. Happy teaching and happy writing.